Live.
And welcome back, folks. This is House Corrections and Institutions Committee. We have shifted gears. We're going to be talking about the MAT, Medically Assisted Treatment Program, that is within our correctional facilities. We have the Director of the DOC Addiction and Mental Health Systems, Annie Remiciano. And because we have such a new committee, and I thought it would be good for us to go around and introduce ourselves. So,
very good. I'm Chip Troiano. Annie and I have met each other many years ago. I represent Hardwick, Standard, and Walden. I'm the vice chair of this committee.
How are you, Annie? I'm Connor Casey from Montpelier here.
Hi, I'm Gina Galfetti, and I'm representing Beartown, Old Chunk of Williamstown.
John Harrison, Weathersfield, Cavenders, Baltimore.
Wayne LaRush is good. Berkshire, Franklin, Richford, and Highgate.
Michelle Boslin, Wyndham County, Wyndham 3, which is Westminster, Rockingham, and Brookline.
Hi, good afternoon, Amy. Eric McGuire, Rutland City.
Welcome, Director, Representative Tristan Roberts, Halifax with Wilmington and Whitingham. And I'm the clerk here.
He's the clerk. So we're spread out through the state and also our seating charts up there. So welcome.
So for the record, I am Annie Remiciano, and I am the Director of Addiction and Mental Health Systems for the Department of Corrections. And as Chair Emmons said, this is actually my 8th year. 8th anniversary is in September. But I did appear to this committee many times before in my role as the Clinical Director and Associate ED at Spectrum. I transitioned into state government as a gubernatorial appointment, of which I still am, as pretrial services director. And when I completed that work and transitioned to the Attorney General's office, I was offered the opportunity to perform and assist the state with my knowledge, skills, and ability in the same area for the Department of Corrections. So I think I am the first director of this type within DOC, and as such, I supervise the mental health chief, Colleen Nelson. 2 of us work as a team, improving the lives of Vermonters within our facilities, and then also serving as contract monitors for the health care that's provided via a contract currently held by Vital Core Health Strategies. So Chair Emmons is correct in that we, the state and DOC, and many other interested parties began the process of examining the viability and administering, developing a medication-assisted treatment program within the walls. It was almost 8 years ago. I looked at the timeline this morning. We started with small pilots because it was Act 176 that gave birth to my role as pretrial services director. The legislation was all in the same package. So we piloted different small groups of incarcerated individuals, the criteria that would allow them to be inducted on the medication or continued from that point all the way to the signage of Act 176, which was in 2018. I know, it's we've had the time warp of COVID and everything else. It's like Rip Van Winkle. But just to add to the excellent introduction that Chair Emmons gave, I think what's also really unique about our jurisdiction, Vermont, is that we not only strove to craft all the definitions she already mentioned, but we really had our eye on the prize, which was equity. Equity with community standards of care, and to replicate those inside of a correctional facility. And then the other thing we really focused on were the SAMHSA definitions of medication-assisted treatment. That law creates that standard not only for free people, but also exactly the same standard for people who are incarcerated. Another really unique thing we did was that we wrote the law so that this medication would become available to somebody as soon as possible, for as long as possible, and practicable, medically necessary, and also regardless of legal status within the department. There are about 8 different legal statuses that somebody could possibly hold, different variances of detained and sentenced. and federal. And so we provide medical care without any discrimination, equally, as long as it's safe to do so, to anybody who comes in through booking. And that includes medication-assisted treatment. Our goal here was first to recognize that this was unique specialty care that we were providing. We were the second state in the country to do this. The law that this committee, with my assistance, the health department's assistance, advocates' assistance, has only been modified once with 3 words since that time because the work was so exquisite. And it has been upheld by the National Governors Association, the National Association for State Healthcare Policy, on which I am on the leadership committee, only person representing a correctional system, I might add, and other think tanks across the nation. National Governors Association paid for me and Dr. Jennifer Clark, who was the medical director at Rhode Island, who was the other state that led the nation. And we went on a US tour in all the different regions before COVID cut that short to talk about our experiences, to talk about how we worked with our legislative bodies, the governor's office, health departments, and everybody, not only on the medical practice, but also on the finance side, policy side, implementation side, from the health perspective, also from the operational security perspective. So, I mean, I just was so proud to be able to do that because we really represented the values of Vermont to the rest of the nation. So, that said, we were also charged in that piece of legislation, Act 176, to present this body with a report, an evaluation about the efficacy of the program. That was submitted in last January. So to that end, we felt it was imperative that we have a neutral, research-based entity to partner with. I shopped the idea around all across the nation and finally got interest with our wonderful University of Vermont, with fortunately a researcher who was coming to UVM to actually study this very thing, was leaving his position at Yale and was coming to UVM. So I partnered with Dr. Eli Klemperer, and together we applied to the Urban Institute for evaluation funding. We were in a very competitive process. There were over 100 applications across the nation for this very, very rare funding for this purpose. And we were one of the few states and the few jurisdictions to be honored with that award. Yeah. So it was a really huge deal. So, I mean, I was on calls with Dr. I know this might not mean anything to you guys, but it's really, it's the pinnacle of my career. I was on phone calls with Dr. Nora Volkoff, who is the head of NIDA, which is the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. I was on calls with Dr. Fauci. This really was a tremendous achievement. So we continue, so that funding is connected to something called JCOIN, and it's Justice, I can't remember, blah, 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 what the acronym is, but we basically reported throughout this period of time, and then obviously the ultimate findings of the evaluation. And then Eli, Dr. Klemperer, also received a competitive award, extra funding to do some more qualitative analysis of the program, interviewing both incarcerated individuals who are on MAT and also the correctional staff. So those qualitative evaluations are still in the final stages of completion. We, I think, scheduled 3 interviews with individuals at Chittenden, so they're completing that, and then once that's done, this will all be compiled, and several more reports will be forthcoming, and we will certainly make those available to this body. So it's been a long and very interesting journey and a tremendous opportunity to serve the most vulnerable people in the state, some of the most vulnerable people in the state who are incarcerated individuals, and to truly align our values as a state with the actual practice of medicine inside of the correctional facilities.
So I think we have some questions.
Sure.
So we have Chip, Wayne, and Eric.
Annie, really glad to have you here for this. It's a very important piece, and I supported it from the beginning. So the committee might want to hear on the assessment. Initially, I remember there was some mix-ups on where assessments had to be done, whether inmates had to report with a prescription for the drug. And so if you could elaborate a little bit on how this all comes down, that would be really great, I think.
Thank you so much for the prompt. So as with all systems, it's we're very much focused on pathways, workflows, and we've done that again with this body, primarily this committee. As you know, all of the statutes governing this are mostly found in Title 28-907, which is the care of incarcerated individuals, although the statute says the word inmates. So upon intake, booking, this body directed the department to begin screening for substance use disorders, obviously including opioid use disorders, within 4 hours of being booked. So embedded, and this is something that I vet on a constant basis and part of our quality assurance, we have pay for performance evaluation metrics, as well as other ways of assessing the big data and the small data on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. So screening and assessment begins within 4 hours. It's a point in time as well as a process. Sometimes it is extremely clear. So one pathway might be that the person attests to being on an active prescription at intake. It's part of the screening questions. Immediately, the nursing staff accesses our PDMP, our prescription monitoring system. This is a federally funded prescription monitoring system for all controlled substances. In Vermont, this is called VPMS, Vermont Prescription Monitoring System. And so every prescriber who prescribes a narcotic, a controlled substances, according to the Controlled Substances Act, has to lodge that prescription with the person's name in that system. So it's an easy database to look at, to check whether or not the person is telling the truth. If the medication is verified, Act 135, which Chair Emmons referenced earlier, is embedded in 801A and B. And it basically says the department is charged with continuing any medications that have been verified and active that were provided in the community. We are charged in continuing that medication until and unless there is evidence that there is some medical contraindication, not operational contraindication, all based on medical necessity to deliver that medication to the individual. And that can only be done via a face-to-face assessment of the individual. It cannot be done administratively. The individual also has the right to sign a release and to require that the department's contractor and the healthcare provider who is making this determination communicate directly with their community provider, so that the community provider's records can also reflect the change in the treatment plan and they're tracking this patient even though they're incarcerated. Because our healthcare system is separate from the rest of the free world. It is a federal regulation that Medicaid and Medicare and all health insurance is turned off when someone is booked inside a state facility. This is all healthcare is paid for out of general fund dollars. So a provider or VHI or any of our big, large healthcare system databases is not necessarily being always fed with the same information. We are merging and moving towards creating stronger connections as best as we can. There are some obstacles that we need to work out. But the insurers themselves and the providers don't have any place to access this information because we have our own pharmacy, We have our own medical staff, we have our own electronic health record, and it's all separate until upon release. The discharge summaries and everything go back to that community provider. There can be any communications for reentry planning and continuity of care, but it's all held by us. So Chip, back to your question. If somebody's got medication on board and it's verified, they're gonna get it. If they don't, the screening that I mentioned continues. Urine drug screening. There's a standardized assessment tool. We might ask for an ROI to get community records. We might talk to family members. We're also going to do a full physical to look for evidence of drug use, which might be seen in the form of track marks, other types of physical manifestations of use, ulcers, other unpleasant things that happen with illicit drug use. So it is a full holistic assessment along with the individual self-report and collateral report. It is not a perfect science. The urine drug screen might be the most perfect objective thing. We also rely on a tool which has the really funny name, especially for Vermont. It's called COWS. COWS.
Gotta love
So
it.
COWS stands for Clinical Opioid Withdrawal Scale. COWS. Boom. And there are objective criteria within COWS, and then there are subjective criteria in COWS. So an objective criteria might be, you can literally see the sweat pouring off somebody because they're in withdrawal. A subjective might be, do you feel nauseous? And the person might say yes, but unless they're vomiting in front of you, it's hard to know whether they're really telling the truth. So we look at the whole component of COWS, but that's another way we gather assessment information to verify whether or not somebody has an opioid use disorder. That's the first step in making our own determination. Somebody must have a moderate to severe opioid use disorder, because just because you might be dabbling in using drugs, a lot of us drink alcohol. There's a continuum. You might be a social drinker and you might have 1 or 2 drinks a night. That's very different than drinking, a fifth. So along this continuum, it doesn't mean that everyone, just because they have an opioid use disorder to some degree, is going to then qualify for the medical necessity that Chair Emmons discussed, which is the threshold for really needing medication-assisted treatment. We are a buprenorphine facing forward state. We always have been. That's also for historic reasons. Previous governors did not have confidence in medication-assisted treatment, and so even though we leapt to the second state in the nation having this kind of progressive policy, we were the second to last state in the country to write that policy. So it's an interesting flip. We've come a long way, baby. So all of these elements, components, are part of a longitudinal assessment process and point-in-time assessment. The other unique thing that we do is that, as I said, there's no discrimination according to legal status. Anyone at any time can ask for an assessment for OUD, opioid use disorder, and to be considered for medication-assisted treatment. But as I started to say, if people are treatment naive, meaning they've never been on anything and they're requesting, we would start them on buprenorphine first, because this medication is a partial agonist, meaning it partially satisfies the craving of those neurotransmitters. Has less of an effect than methadone does, which is a full agonist. And you would want to, it's like the difference between, I may need to have my meniscus tear fixed. That would be the buprenorphine. But I don't need a knee replacement, that would be the methadone. So it's sort of like a dose response failure system, which is typical in a lot of medical care, that you fail out of the lesser medical care to prove that you actually need something that's a really heavy hit. So that said, methadone is also totally available in the facilities. We work hand in glove with the health department and so many community partners to provide this care. We are not designated as an OTP, which is a federal designation. It's a SAMHSA accreditation, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and a DEA license, We do not have that in the Department of Corrections because at the time of writing this legislation, we only had like 10 people on methadone. And we basically said, let's wait and see what happens with the evolution of this. But that doesn't make financial sense or any other sense to maintain that level of accreditation just for 10 people.
So
So
we
we're
have
still
some-
considered an interim
So we are still interim and.
after 6 years, we're still
Yep,
interim?
and the DEA loves it. It's actually become a national model.
So
So
we can get into that a little
we can
bit
get
more,
into
because we
that.
got a few more questions here.
I didn't mean to interrupt,
no,
excuse me.
no, and I'm going on. Stop it.
So we've got Wayne, we've got Eric, and we've got Troy, and we've got Tristan.
Now, did you say that you mentioned qualitative assessments, but did you mention you had quantitative assessments
Oh,
of some
yes.
sort?
Yes.
So what's your metric for success and failure? What constitutes success of the program or failure of the program? And how do you evaluate that during a period of time, which the program's been in place as opposed to pre-program?
Big question. So the first metric is safety. I mean, the medical standards on, for instance, the delivery of methadone is literally one of the most globally studied drugs. And it is in the top 10 of the World Health Organization's essential medications. So there is a ton of literature about administering methadone and methadone treatment in general. Safety is imperative with methadone because of the strength I mentioned. You can kill somebody if you give them too much methadone. It will suppress your autonomic nervous system, your heart, your breathing, everything will just shut down.
So has the incidence of those types of reactions
Yes.
decreased with the new program?
So what I can tell you is throughout this whole process, the pilots till now, there has not been a single death in the Department of Corrections attributed to medication-assisted treatment.
And before?
Correct.
Or before?
Before, no, none,
So never in history?
no.
So that doesn't demonstrate success or failure?
What it does is that we've introduced this now as a medication. Before it was illicit, it was contraband. So now we have successfully introduced a medication that before historically was always seen as something we needed to keep out. And we were not treating people who had opioid use disorder. So this has been a huge paradigm shift and one that clearly tested operations as well as continuing to provide safe and secure medical treatment. So that we haven't had an adverse event with this enormous change, I would say, is a huge success. I would say the other success is that the clinical guidelines that we promulgated then underwent national peer review and had and that was another report we provided to this body. There was very, very little national critique in the terms of modifications. We obviously incorporated any modifications, and those clinical guidelines themselves have been used at the national level and were informed by the health department. So we have tried to build a program around the best medical practices, modifying them as we needed to operationally to be done inside of a correctional facility where people obviously are, not free to wander around and have to be monitored. Their safety has to be monitored. We haven't had any adverse events, and we've adhered to the medical standards of practice inside of a correctional institution, which I can only tell you, I never appreciated this, having worked on the outside, but it is an enormous task. So, and I would say that I was just asked to be this summer the keynote speaker at a SAMHSA regional meeting where I spoke about this. And one of the top directors of SAMHSA, there were 3 of them, and top leadership of the DEA came to hear my speech, and I helped facilitate a 3-day meeting. And they came because of what Vermont is doing. And they basically said, this is like all of you other people need to do what they're doing. And this is all coming because you may not be aware, the Bureau of Justice actually ruled this summer that all correctional, it's a violation of the Americans with Disability Act for correctional systems to not be doing what Vermont and Rhode Island are doing. And they were about to hold the Bureau of Justice in contempt because the Bureau of Prisons was not in line. And they had scrambled all summer to get the Bureau of Prisons up to what we are doing. So it's been the quality and the quantity. So I have 8 buckets that I monitor with data that we validate the data sets and we clean it all the time. And I have researchers inside the department and then also analysts on the contractor side. And we review all these metrics all the way on every bucket. And then I have line lists of literally names of individuals because I care about every single person. They are not faceless to me. And so an example of that is when we have diversion trackers at each facility, when people divert medication, how is the treatment plan adjusted or not adjusted? So I review every single case and I have dialogues with the contractor, and we just had a beautiful dialogue because I noticed some variances that I wasn't happy with. I said, I would like more information about this, give this to me within 24 hours. They absolutely did. They said, look, we missed this, we missed this, we missed this. And I said, thank you so much for not hiding from me. Thank you for looking into this, and let's work to rectify this now. And what is the DQI, what's the quality control process that now needs to be implemented so that we reduce who we might have missed even more. I mean, it was 3 people out of 50. So, we're in the 95 percentile, but, we're always striving for let's have a seamless process and be doing the best we can all the time. Not dependent on people, but dependent on systems and operations.
Anything else? So we've got Eric, Troy, and Tristan.
No, I thank you for your time. That was really what I just wanted to follow up on because as you're aware, the maintenance programs and facilities were first originally established to help. They would be provided the medicated assisted treatment, but ultimately, if they were serving a longer term sentence, the idea was to taper them slowly off. That's what the beginning stuff was. It was all nationally strictly regulation in which OTPs then weren't put into place. I didn't realize that Vermont is still considered an interim delegate of the medication. Everything you're saying, I agree with and I hear, but this has always been my question. And I can go from personal experience of running housing programs for 14 years in Rutland. An individual comes on in the house that just got done doing 25 years, and I'm getting them set up with a provider, the BPA, because he's on that medication in the facility. Response to that?
Tell me, what is your...
An individual that had served a long-term sentence comes on into the home and transferred on out, and he was on a maintenance program in the facility, men or women. They're on a maintenance program in the facility, getting done with a 20-year sentence. What is that individual doing on maintenance?
So you saying that the person then does not have a provider on the outside?
No. We get him, he comes on in a provider, but he's been under the supervision and the custody of the Department of Corrections for 20 years. And he's on maintenance in the facility.
Opioid use disorder.
Yeah, but I think he's asking how could he have developed an opioid use disorder while he was in the...
If an individual went in and say 1994 and is coming on out now in 2018, I'll use that case. And he comes on out and he's on maintenance while he was in the facility.
So that does happen. Many individuals come forward to us and say, I lied on this, I lied on that, I have a long history, I'm terrified of getting out and falling right back into the same place that I was. I mean, we all know that addiction doesn't go away. You can be dry, but it doesn't go away. I often read about this in electronic health records. So again, it's not the department's decision It's a qualified provider who is looking at all of the information that is available and making it independent. Our providers have medical autonomy.
Mhm.
And so if the providers determine that somebody does have an opioid use disorder, I hate to say it, there is contraband in the facilities. And
But
you know this.
That's,
And so it is obviously possible to have exposure to alcohol, to all kinds of drugs inside of the facility.
so at this time, out of everybody that is currently lodged, and I'm not talking about detainees, but individuals that have been sentenced that are under the custody of facility, roughly what percentage are currently on an MAT?
So about 50% are on, and that's actually a hanging chad thought that I didn't connect to something I said earlier. When I was meeting with the SAMHSA and the DEA folks nationally, that was another point that they wanted to make to the other states who were there, because they basically said, we know that 50% or more of all of your states' incarcerated population probably meet the criteria for OUD and medical necessity for MAT. And that was a question I got asked a lot. Philadelphia asked me that, Delaware asked me that. They were trying to do like, we only want to pay for 10%. And I was like, well, do you really think that? I mean, is that the way you really want to do this? Medical necessity, or just you've capped it at 10%? I don't know how you determine that medically if you're going to withhold care from other people who also meet the criteria. So
That's part of our criteria in statute.
Right.
Is that the person needs to be medically necessary, and it is determined by a qualified health professional. In another part of the statute, there is a definition of a qualified medical provider for that. So we've connected those dots, that it's not just arbitrary, oh yeah, we're just going to hand it out. We wanted some real.
Well, that's where I was going to, because it's always been a concern through things that we controlled substances, medications are your fiscal cash exchange inside of the facility. So by providing.
So is coffee.
But, well.
Yeah, I hear you.
That's where you get into the diversion.
Exactly. So the idea, concept at times can come on out to say the more that we place on this diverts that level from taking. So if I'm hearing that it's being used to make treatment, yeah, I agree with that. But we do know at times it can be used to divert and provide safety, stability, and security within a facility. Case in point, individual that's been incarcerated for 26 years, whatever the assessment may say, okay, I'm not a doctor. If that's what the doctor's saying, that's what the doctor's saying.
Because we were real clear in statute, we don't want it to be arbitrary. And we did the definitions the same as what's done in the general public. So we have more questions here. Troy, Tristan, Gina, Wayne.
I am curious if the MAT is paired with any other sort of therapy beyond like a group or a 12-step. Like, are you doing cognitive behavioral therapy at all? And do you have any data on relapse upon release?
So excellent questions. Thank you. So yes. So we model the entire system of care on a SAMHSA framework called Recovery Oriented System of Care. ROSC is the acronym. ROSC is the new version of the old philosophy, which is there's no wrong door. There are many, multiple, unique pathways, combination of pathways, personal choice, self-determination of how somebody recovers from anything, life, knee replacement, depression, whatever it may be. Our role as a department and a provider of healthcare services is to ensure that there is absolute access to care and that care is evidence-based and offers a huge menu of options. So we cannot force people to accept treatment. They must consent to all treatment, including any medication. There are informed consent forms for every single treatment that is provided. And they also can refuse any treatment inside of the department, and that also is documented if it is refused. We can set up specialty medical services in the community, and they can literally refuse to get on the van to go in the moment before they have to be at the appointment, and then ask for it again. So that said, there is a full array of auxiliary services for substance use disorder. I will tell you that right now, what the meta-analysis has shown for opioid use disorder specifically is that medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder, unique only to opioid use disorder, medication-assisted treatment is the only effective treatment for opioid use disorder. That is not true for other addictions. All addictions are not the same. Cancer is not the same.
Sorry, I don't mean to.
I'm happy to provide you the studies and the citations. This comes straight, this is actually in the evaluation report. It's in the citations and the bibliography of the evaluation report we filed on January 15th of last year. But I'm happy to send it afresh to you.
That might be worth sending. If you could just send that to Phil Petty. That's good, great. Anything else, Troy?
Just the
So we-
relapse.
So we have all cognitive, we use actually a curriculum called Integrated Change Therapy, ICT, which was actually developed by a psychologist here in Vermont out of the SBIRT, Screening, Brief Intervention, and Referral to Treatment Protocol. It was a grant that the Department of Health had for about 8 years. It's part of SAMHSA's NREP, nationally recognized evidence-based practices. And it identifies the 14 different cognitive behavioral skills that are cross-effective for both mental health and substance use, because we know that most people are co-occurring. So that's an example of one of the treatments we provide in a group setting. In terms of relapse after release, we don't have access to their medical records post-release. Those are all obviously
Anything anecdotal.
So what we have, and we're going to be publishing soon, is a dashboard, and I can send the links to Philip also. We have developed a whole series of dashboards that has tons of this data that's mostly updated quarterly on the DOC website. The dashboard that's about to be published, we did in partnership with DEVA, with the Department of Vermont Health Access, our Medicaid sister agency. And we've worked for many, many years with their analysts, pre and post law implementation, to look at the post-release engagement and retention on MAT from corrections, pre and post Act 176, and obviously you can do your own pre and post from March when we shut down for COVID as well. So the numbers that I can recall is that it's about 60% of people are continuing on their medication within a window of time, because there are delays in the claims data. So it doesn't always show up right away, but when you pull that window far enough out, you can see that it's about 60% of the people are being retained and continuing, which is really high.
Mm-hmm. So we have some more questions here. Tristan, Gina, and Wayne.
Thank you, Director. I hate to start with a correction of yourself, but just it's evident from how you care about the people you work with and serve that I think Fauci is lucky to be on the phone with you.
I missed it.
That what?
I think Fauci was lucky to be on the phone with her.
Oh, okay.
Correcting what you said earlier. This is not an area I'm very familiar with, so I kind of have some basic questions if you don't mind, but I'm really fascinated. And one question I have is, I think in the kind of lay person's world, we talk about rehab. Is this rehab? Is this how we talk about rehab these days? Has that changed?
This is rehab today. Old rehab was drying people out. And I mean, I did consultation with the Betty Ford Clinic and many other nationally recognized centers on clinical practice. And for instance, in the old days, if you went to the Betty Ford Clinic, if you were actually on an antidepressant, they would demand that you needed to come off because you weren't actually in recovery if you were on an antidepressant. So, you know, the science has really evolved around how we look at all of these things. And so, yes, being on medication-assisted treatment is nationally recognized as being in recovery. It is not being free of all substances. We wouldn't ask somebody to recover from diabetes that somehow it's mind over matter to get off of insulin.
So recovery is also the new rehab, sort of.
And we believe that there are many pathways. Some people may find great solace in going to a 12-step meeting. For other people, 12-step absolutely does not work. Some people may find great solace in having religious counseling. But again, it's not up to us to be judgmental or biased about how somebody chooses to establish their own definition of health and wellness, nor should we be biased and judgmental about how they get there.
Thank you.
Gina, and then Wayne, and then
Okay,
John.
so I just want to make sure I'm following this correctly. So sobriety is no longer categorized as having been removed from an opioid?
So
Because what
medication
you're
is-
saying is that folks, the goal is no longer to wean people off.
actually was medically, it was never a medical goal to wean somebody off of medication-assisted treatment unless they elected to do so.
Okay.
So a medical provider would never come, in the community even, they would never come to somebody and say, it's time to take you off this medication.
So it's just swapping one drug for another, basically.
Medication-assisted treatment
Right.
helps people live functional lives.
Yeah, no, I follow.
Without other
I just wanted
adverse
to
health
make
events.
sure I had that
Yeah,
correct.
absolutely. So a medical provider, so in both in the facility and in the community, there is a federal designation called X-waivered provider. These are providers who the DEA have recognized to have a special license for the prescribing, possibly administering of the medication. There was also just a gigantic federal law that was passed and signed, 2 weeks ago, where the federal government has decided that in the light of the continuing opioid epidemic, that the requirements that were in place with becoming an X-waivered provider were creating undue, unnecessary barriers to the provision of this care. And they've actually removed many of the criteria for that X-waivered process. There's still going to be educational requirements for people to administer buprenorphine, but they, in their analysis at the federal level, they decided that this was creating more onerous access to care, et cetera, that were not creating any greater safety for individuals, and they struck it from the law. So it's going in the other direction. So I'm just saying that at the federal level, this is what, people like Dr. Fauci, Dr. Volkoff have testified about, that we want more access because these are very safe medications. And the other side of the picture of fentanyl deaths and xylene and everything else that's happening, is very, very real. And we want to encourage people to come on a safe medication and to move towards wellness and health and having stable social determinants. And that this is absolutely right now with the science we have the way to go. I'll also just add that for somebody on buprenorphine in the free world and or methadone, most of the studies I'm just about to cite are really on methadone, not buprenorphine. But it takes about 7 years for somebody's life to stabilize while they're on methadone before they actually start to move from like just surviving to thriving and more stability. And I would say for a correctional population that has even less stability and more like of that hill to climb to be a functioning community member, it's probably even longer. So there is not a medical determination of cured. We don't have a way to cure this yet. There are drugs in the pipeline right now, and I've heard about them, that are in clinical trials right now to try to address that. But it really is just like if you are severely bipolar and you need lithium, you're probably not ever going to come off of that for your whole lifetime. But it's your personal choice. And the department also doesn't force people to be on the medication. They again have to elect to administer treatment.
Couple more questions. John and Eric?
Yeah, bye.
John?
Do we, once the person's out and they need to stay on medication, we as a society make it affordable and accessible? And when we get done with that, I'd like to elaborate a little bit on methamphetamines and possibly alcohol addiction and what long-term.
Yes. So yes, our health department and Department of Vermont Health Access have again really led the nation in this area. And we, it's on the formulary for Medicaid and also in Blue Cross Blue Shield. Buprenorphine is on the formulary.
Okay.
And the health commissioner a long time ago, I think it was actually, this work was done at the same time, signs every time the health commissioner resigns and the new one gets appointed, they re-sign what's called a standing order with all of our pharmacies so that anyone can go in to get naloxone, Narcan, the prevention drug, free of charge at any pharmacy. There's a standing order from the head doctor of our state for that. The second part of your question with methamphetamine. So as I said earlier, every addiction, the science around the addiction is different because the drugs all have different courses of actions in our bodies and different implications for treatment. The science is not equal for every drug. For methamphetamine, there is no medication-assisted treatment. And so there is only cognitive behavioral treatment for the treatment of methamphetamine disorders. The same for cocaine disorders. The department, actually I'll go back to alcohol because that was the other drug you asked about, the other substance you asked about. And so for alcohol use disorder, there's also medication-assisted treatment. And so this legislation and this direction from this body includes not just medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder, but this was also our thinking with Act 135, which is all medications should be continued. So if somebody's on a medication-assisted treatment for alcohol, like disulfiram, it must be continued. Antabuse. There are other antidepressants, SSRIs, that are sometimes used for the treatment of that disorder as well. So if that was the reason why the person was on the medication and they elected to continue it, we would prescribe it to them. And then I also monitor that to make sure in the discharge planning that they're also offered those medications at release. The one that you didn't mention, but is killing most of us, along with alcohol, is actually tobacco. And so,
caffeine.
Well, caffeine doesn't necessarily kill. Sugar doesn't either. Chocolate doesn't either. So with nicotine replacement, it is more of a security issue because it is very difficult to provide those patches within the security confines. What I've been able to do is to work very closely with the tobacco group at the health department, and we mirror the interventions that they do in the free world inside of the department. And I've been lobbying to have vending machines in the entryways of the facilities that dispense nicotine replacement therapy, which is also on the Medicaid formulary, so it could be free. Condoms, HIV tests, pregnancy tests, all of these things that people will need because these are very expensive in the community and we want to head them off with interventions and preventions, harm reduction. So we're trying to weave all of this inside of the department and then also make sure that they have access to it when they leave.
Have you seen any of the research on the use of hallucinogenics to help you rewire your brain?
Yes, and I have some friends who are venture capitalists and who are funding that research.
We have some more questions. Eric and then Gina, did you have your hand back up?
No, I'm
okay. Okay.
No, just quickly, and again, thank you.
Tristan.
So what I'm hearing is kind of, if an individual is on medicated assisted treatment in the facility, they're pretty much getting the same level of care and that they're gonna receive when they transfer to their local provider, when they're exited, and they're gonna be referred on over to either the spoke or the hub. They're getting that same level. So what I'm hearing is like that level of fidelity is in place. So it's a good, smooth transition to the provider. Is
In
that,
theory,
In theory.
in theory,
theory?
that's
in
what
theory, I
we
mean,
hope.
there's tons of different ways it can go wrong.
We hope.
no, but what I'm saying is, what you're sharing is that they're getting that same level of care that they would.
I would submit they're actually getting more because we have something that the free people don't have. And that is technology assisted care. We have a contract with a British organization through our tablet provider, GTL, Biopath, that is unique. The province of Ontario rolled this out as a health intervention to all of their citizens. I've talked to the health department about this to offer this universally to all citizens of Vermont. I think it's still under consideration, but it's called Breaking Free. And it is a self-directed, very, very highly sophisticated program that's on their tablets that starts with a self-assessment, has like 70 different substances that are possible pathways of assessment and then intervention. It's got artificial intelligence in it so that it keeps learning from what the person has put into it and the person can change it. And then it takes them on pathways that are all evidence-based about relapse prevention, coping skills, has sophisticated mindfulness exercises with full AI, audio visual, real people talking to them. And it's really state of the art. So they can elect to have access to that for free for up to a year post-release. I control that. Caseworkers or LUS or anybody can email me and say John Doe is releasing. He wants to continue his Breaking Free app. I flip the switch. I print out a way to do that. They can access it through the URL on any device. And then they reset their password and they have that used for up to a year. I get a metric of the date of the use, no names or what they're putting into the system, but I have dashboards that I look at all the time and that I share with the healthcare contractor. We also have open ears coaches. We have coaches in the facilities who are recovery coaches. They offer individual and we're offering group interventions. We also liaise with the recovery centers upon release. Chair Emmons has witnessed me in action about that. And so we have a lot of things that actually are equal to, not necessarily totally more, because I know we didn't want to go overboard, but the technology assisted care was just so fantastic. We really wanted to offer it. And we tried to do it during the pandemic. Sadly, we didn't have that in place during the pandemic. And so I literally made a library of like 1,000 pages of self-management information for substance use and mental health. And we had an index and they had an order form. And we passed that out every day on the units and had people check off what they wanted. And then staff made copies and then we took that into the unit. If we'd had Breaking Free, that would have eliminated all of that. But that is like all the stuff we were trying to do to get help to people.
I really appreciate your passion and zeal to serve the individuals that are in there in this program and so forth. And I greatly appreciate that. We'll talk after this though for a second.
He'll talk to you.
I mean, really,
He'll talk to you.
my passion comes from a place of lived experience, and by the grace of God, I could have been incarcerated. So, this is something that I live a daily walk, that because of my white female privilege, that I was born when I was born and where I was born, that I'm not behind the walls.
So we have a few more questions. So we have Tristan and Mary.
That was going to be one of my questions. What you just said, are we giving Vermonters better medical care behind bars? I think the answer is clearly yes.
The technology assisted care is the only unique feature of our system that isn't available to the public. But I would also say that because they have access to the internet, they are also able to access many apps and other things that our folks are not. So this was really also an attempt to level that playing field. This is really unique, and I mean, it's pretty special. There are facsimiles in the public domain for free people, but not just exactly the same thing. But otherwise, it is the standard of care that is in the community.
The follow-up on another. I think you were referring to psychedelics that are still federally scheduled. Do you provide? There are those that are currently prescribed in the free world. Do you prescribe them in the walls?
No. No, we have not had anybody identify as being prescribed psychedelics entering the facility in the 8 years that I've been in this role.
Or would you? So I'm thinking of esketamine, for example, which could also be just used as a treatment for someone. Ketamine and esketamine
Oh,
is
esketamine.
one that's I think been already more legally. Well, they have different legal profiles, but both are tested and used. Would you prescribe that for someone that, for example, with PTSD?
So we have had one case. Yes. So our providers typically go off of FDA guidelines. Obviously, there's off-label use of medications, and we experience that in the community too. I've been prescribed things that, were not for the disorder, but my doctor has said, this hasn't worked, this hasn't worked, this hasn't worked. We've gone down the dose response, and we're going to finally try this, Annie. Do you agree to this? So we have had one case that I'm personally aware of with ketamine, and it was incredibly difficult because they were transitioning. We had run out of all the options, as I just said, inside of the facility, but they were releasing. So we worked with the health department and DIVA to find a provider that was proximal to where they were being released to, which was the Montpelier area, to find a provider who was willing to assess them for that and willing to be the prescriber of record. And so we worked with a specialized team to do that. So, I mean, that's how unique and granular we'll get to try to give somebody what they need so that they're successful and we don't want them back.
So we have another question, and we do have, oh, I forgot.
I was just going to ask a simple question. What's the program cost per year for this?
It's about 1.6 million.
It's about what we planned.
We planned it is. Might be 1.7.
And my question was, is there any follow through once they leave? Because as we've talked about in this committee, the transition going out into the community really concerns me. I'm almost afraid we're doing a lot of this good work, but then it could fall short really quick, really fast as they transition down. So do you have any information on that?
So that's going to be the second wave of work. When we finally publish that engagement and retention for Medicaid claims, we're going to be able to look at facility, where the person released from the facility, but also what community they released in. And I want to use this data with the health department and all of our partners, all of our stakeholders, to look at, again, be curious, appreciative inquiry, where there are counties and facilities where there's clearly discharge planning happening at higher rates and then higher retention engagement. What is driving that? How is that happening? And then what is there to learn from places where that's not happening? And again, it's not to punish anybody because there's also personal choice involved here. People can elect to go off. I see on a daily basis, back to some of the questions you guys asked, people actually asking their healthcare provider inside of the facility to wean them off. They've gotten their date and they want to come off of it. They don't want to be in the community on it.
Mm-hmm.
So I review those too. And so I actually wrote up and we implemented a warning based on all of the research of the high lethality that may pose. But again, at the same time, saying this is absolutely your choice. And if this is what you do, we just want to inform you of this, and they have to sign it. Because we also are part of the health department's social autopsy program. So I look at all of the deaths and all the autopsies of people who are die within 12 months of release. And in this last year, this is on the health department's website, you can look at it. This last year, most of the deaths, I think we doubled from 11 to like 17. And most of those were releases within like 24 to 36 hours. And they had declined care.
And then they go, they relapse.
And they,
It's part of the reason for.
they do something, and then everything's laced with fentanyl. You guys know that. I mean, Narcan isn't going to do it anymore. You know, even if you smoke a joint, you know, it's laced. So if you are not growing it yourself, it's Russian roulette.
The most vulnerable time is within the first 48 hours when someone is released.
Especially if somebody's been asked to wean, they're opioid naive, and then if they take anything, boom, it's pretty much going to be.
So we have to go on the floor, and I'm sure if the committee wants to do a deeper dive in this, Annie would be more than willing to come back. I know it's a controversial issue. So let's go off of YouTube. Thank you, folks.